And I'd like to welcome Jesse Wheeler, who is the Vegetation Program Manager for Acadia National Park here in Maine. Jesse has years of experience with invasive plants, formerly as the head of the exotic plant management team, and still in his role now. And I'm delighted to have him help mostly present this presentation on invasive plant control methods and how to select them. So Jesse, take it away.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm happy to join you guys here. And I guess so we're really just going to give a broad overview of methods, right? Control methods, how we're removing these invasive plants from the landscape. And so what we're going to kind of do is go through mechanical and manual methods. Uh, Again, brief overview of what they require, maybe some of the tools, using herbicide as a method, flame weeding, biological control, and then also we'll discuss some things to consider when you're making treatment recommendations, just kind of things on the landscape, kind of, land ownership, that kind of things, land use. And then we'll provide some space at the end for conundrums or questions, sort of case by case scenarios, things like that to kind of think through that we can discuss. So that's a little bit about of sort of the outline for this session. Um, so I'll start right off with sort of some heavy duty options: forestry, mulching, brush cutting. So essentially, what this is really is removing kind of this above ground biomass of plant material, right? And so what the strategy here is removing carbohydrates so that from the above ground area, so that eventually the plant dies. You still have that below ground biomass that can still send up sprouts. But these are sort of the heavy duty methods if you have heavy machinery like forestry mulching, or brush cutters or even chainsaws. This is helpful if you're really faced with kind of a wall of invasive shrubs or trees. Sometimes it's just kind of an initial approach that may be needed. Um, it can be done any time of year for these woody species as well, as long as it's not too soupy wet, right, or something like that, and access is still an option. Um, it can be something to where the forestry mulching, there's some links in here that we'll share as well when you get that information, where you can find some uh, further information about what forestry mulching is in particular. I just kind of have this picture on the left where it's essentially like a big wood chipper on a front end loader or something. But anyhow, there's sort of an added benefit potential to when you're like chipping up the carbon and just spreading it along the forest floor, that it can kind of do that. You're leaving it all there. You're not taking it off site. So that's kind of nice, and getting that nutrient cycling going in again. Um, and then I'm lumping in brush cutting and kind of chainsawing as sort of like that step down approach. But again, you're kind of like taking out a lot of this material, and a lot of it is just to kind of get in there so you can get a better look at what you're dealing with as well. Uh, so along with some of the mechanical manual removal methods that we like to use at Acadia, and I definitely would recommend if you've got a lot less than a kind of a wall of invasives, but you've got sort of a few stems here or there, particularly of small saplings, seedlings, or single stem shrubs, is digging or using a weed wrench tool. Um, so digging, you can use shovels and other things certainly to try to pull it out, but you have to kind of be aware that you have some soil disturbance when that happens. And so that's something to where we you want to think about what kind of soil disturbance you're doing, both in terms of for erosion potential issues, but then also what is in the seed bank and what you're just providing some extra space for new plants to grow and secondary invasions. But anyhow, so I'd like to kind of uh, look at this weed wrench as an option, because what is really useful, it can do usually around a little under an inch or so diameter of a stem. And this is sort of a couple of images here showing where it uses the leverage of that handle to really pull out the whole root system out of the ground at once. In these images here, this actually it's hard to identify on the right, but it's a Japanese barberry, which we usually don't use the weed wrench for that because it's kind of multi-stem and hard to get at. But this in particular one actually had been treated with herbicide a year prior and still had some live sprouts that were coming up. So we kind of had to get it out. And the weed wrench did a real easy job because half the root material was dead anyway, but it still was something alive. So that was sort of like a way, sort of a secondary treatment, but certainly this can be done with a healthy plant as well. I wouldn't really recommend this for like rhizomatic plants or things that propagate well vegetatively. Um, so again, probably would focus on this method. It be labor intensive as well, but just if you've got kind of like a few scattered around. Cutting, just kind of cutting in general. So this could be something that's could be easily done as far as what tools are required, right? So like loppers and hand saws and things like that. Just kind of manual cutting. Again, that above ground biomass, so you're not really getting the below ground stuff. So whatever it is, whether it's herbaceous material or woody plants that we're getting at here, um, they're likely to kind of to re-sprout. So this is something to where you're really thinking about what's the time frame that you're managing in over the course of the season. So if you can get in multiple times during the season or multiple years in a row. Um, Again, this can be okay, certainly for individual invasive shrubs or trees that you can really like keep an eye on and get after any sprouting that's there and recut. Mowing, weed whacking, or brush hogging, woodland edges of forest trails may be kind of a similar thought there, right? Where you can have easy access, you can kind of get at multiple times. Um, this image here actually is for Japanese knotweed, where this could be an approach where you can take cutting multiple times, but in this particular case, we have cutting that is also combined with a revisit later in the season with a different control method. Hand pulling. So labor intensive, but just requires your hands and some gloves. Where this is something that if you're looking at, especially for this time of year, with sort of more the spring herbaceous plants like a garlic mustard in the image on the left, um, or biennial plants that are going to be, kind of sending up some seeds and flowers and then going to die, but you can pull out their stem easy enough early in the spring before they seed. That it's a great method to use. Um, but again, kind of thinking about like what the impacts may be. So this is the light-handed approach, certainly, but it's difficult to do this if you've got like very compacted soil or if you're on a slope, right? And just kind of that access you kind of have to think about as well. Um, so kind of recap a little bit of kind of main points to consider when considering these mechanical and manual methods, I would say is yeah, what's that soil like or and slope? So what's the terrain that you're working on? Thinking about what if it is going to be a lot of soil disturbance, you're likely to get a pretty good sized secondary invasion or seed bank of whatever was there, kind of repopulating the year later. Erosion, being careful what kind of erosion options there might be depending on the machinery and tools you're using and how much activity you have. So think about what might be the roots or the plants that are there now, whether they're invasive or native, how they're stabilizing the area, and just think about that as you pull them out. Um, and then of course there's the destruction of the native plants that we want to keep there in the desired condition that we want, often is sort of the seedlings and the native ground cover that we want to have there, as you're moving with machinery and things like that, thinking about what's that kind of off target impact. Certainly like things like the hand pulling or the cutting of individual stems, that's nice because you identify the plant and you go to it and that's pretty much all you're taking. One thing I'll mention, especially for when you're using equipment in these areas, is um, cleaning it, or at least um, before you go into an area, making sure it's not covered in a whole bunch of debris, soil, and things like that on saw blades. I'm thinking of, or it's even your boots, your boot tread, right? And maybe even more importantly, when you leave an infested site, just making sure that you have a chance to clean all your equipment, and maybe if it's something where you have actual like ATV treads or something like that you want to clean up. So just sort of a note in there when you're coming in areas and you're going to do some kind of heavy work to the landscape. And then just sort of a still kind of on the mechanical thing, but it's a little bit of a side note. Um, you can do is in a little bridge of a combination of mechanical removal, but then a covering. And so this image here is a product called buckthorn baggies, which I do have some. Oops, sorry about that. Uh, we're going to be implementing in some areas in Acadia this year, but the thought here is essentially you can cut a stump and put essentially a heavy duty bag, like trash bag, over it is what essentially it is. Zip tie it, leave it for a year, and then in theory it you don't get any more sprouts, and you can reuse the bag. So that's in theory for that, and you don't have to use any chemical with it. And
Okay, and
then Nancy, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so this next slide here regarding weed block fabric and mulching is kind of a heavy duty version of the buckthorn baggie. This kind of setup where you are cutting the plants and layering on top various materials like a bulk bark mulch or wood chips. And then black plastic or tarp or non-woven geotextile material, and then, potentially piling on top of that additional material to hold the tarp or geotextile fabric in place. This kind of a sandwich approach to mulching is another sort of form of mechanical removal with covering. This schematic here is from a publication from my colleague Doug Saigan in New Hampshire. We have the link to that in this presentation, which will be shared with you. And this is a photo from, again, the folks that Alita mentioned yesterday, the folks at the Coastal Mountains Land Trust, who have been for years doing this form of management for Japanese knotweed along the Duck Trap River. And so in their case, this was a dynamic environment. And so they, instead of using like a material on top, they ended up using stakes to hold this fabric down. So multiple approaches to using a covering and mulching type of technique. This also has to be left in place for much longer than the buckthorn baggie, depending on the size of the knotweed patch, or goutweed, bishop's weed. This could work for that too, but years, years and years. And in a dynamic environment, you'd be putting it down and taking it up each year. So that's a little bit about covering for knotweed and other herbaceous plants.
Great. And then sort of again, another a little bit of a hybrid approach with the mechanical removal. If you're kind of looking for efficiencies, perhaps you've got at least a 2-year window on that site. One option is kind of the initial, cut out that above ground biomass, just removing those stems. Uh, and then walking away, coming back the next growing season, and sure enough, there'll be stump sprouts, and then you can go to your herbicide and your chemical treatment there when it's kind of lower growth, and it sort of is a little bit of an efficient way to do things, but it definitely requires you having a revisit. So in the kind of the chemical or herbicide world, there's still quite a few different methods and kind of tools that can be used for that. And a lot of it may depend on the vegetation type you have, or the time of year. And so this is where we'll go through a few, like foliar, which is essentially spraying the leaf of the plant, basal bark, cut stem or cut stump, hack and frill, and stem injection. So the foliar approach, this is something where I feel like if thinking of herbicide, or thinking of, like herbiciding dandelions in your lawn or something, is sort of what comes to mind imagery for most folks, right? It's essentially the the liquid form of uh, spraying your plants that you want, your weeds. So this is something to where when you're selecting what you're going to use, and we're not going to get into specifics necessarily of what types of herbicide in this presentation, or formulations, but you're thinking about what kind of, if a broad spectrum or selective herbicide that you're going to be choosing for your target plant, right? And making sure that you're reading those labels so that you're kind of matching it up to what you're recommending for removal. Uh, and maybe this is something that can be, this application may be preferable for herbaceous invasives that can't be hand pulled. So if you've kind of gone down that sort of like decision tree of what methods we're going to use, and you're kind of like, well, mechanical or manual methods are just really not going to be feasible in the long run, or maybe it's got to have a combination. um, so then you're thinking about, uh, which stage. So one thing I would think of is sort of, what we like to do is sort of a rule of thumb is like also thinking about what your human health and what your own risk management might be, right, too. And sort of the impact to the rest of the environment. So because foliar spraying, it is lower concentrations than some other methods we're going to be talking about of the active ingredient. It's still, you're sending stuff into the air, you're sending particulates and droplets into the air. So that's where you got to think about, like, is it a site where, is it always a windy site and it's going to just brings, and you've got like those environmental limitations that you've got to be within those constraints. What's the height of the vegetation? That's something that we always are concerned with. And so if it's something where the vegetation is higher than your waist or something, or then you're probably going to want to consider something additional or different than just a foliar application to hit all of that. If otherwise, you just have to be very, very careful. um, so again, this is kind of like one where it can be very effective, depending on what you use. It might take several weeks for you to notice any change to the plant, uh, but it's something that you want to look out for the potential of drift, essentially, of the droplets and off-target hazards. So those off-target hazards may be other people, or sensitive in areas in the environment like water, but it's also other native plants that we want to keep around. And the timing is kind of key with this, in a way as well. So again, looking at your label and kind of doing your research on what products you're going to use, in the phenology and biology of your plant. So this is something to where in this image, for example, this is Japanese knotweed that's been foliar sprayed. This one in particular, we really don't want to be spraying it when the plant is flowering, and which goes for most of these because it does attract pollinators, and most pollinators, like bees, do not do very well with a lot of the active ingredients for herbicide. Um, but then also the timing can be beneficial, when you think of the phenology of your plant, especially with invasives that leaf out earlier in the spring than a lot of our natives. And on the other side, where they might leaf out or stay leaved on before they senesce and drop their leaves in the fall, it gives you the extra little window where you have fewer of the natives that you might accidentally hit with your herbicide. But also helps for identification of the invasive plant that's there if it's kind of standing out on its own. But this is also something where you want to make sure that, as I move to the next slide here, you want to make sure that you want to get full coverage of the plant. So thinking about how it's situated on that site. If you can, you really want to get 90% of the leaves of that plant covered, just enough to so it's not totally dripping off, completely. So you just want to get a nice coverage. Um, but also thinking about where your site is, like what's your access, like how far off the trail or your road that you need to go, because you're going to need to carry a lot of volume of liquid. So it's sort of, if it's, thinking about what's your coverage, like how many gallons per acre are you going to need. Hopefully it's not that much, but it's just one other thing to think about is, you have to mix this material, you have to bring in kind of large volumes of it around. um, Usually backpack sprayers, right? That's kind of thing, like in this picture, or small handheld, will work for smaller populations. There are ready-made formulations if it's not necessarily that it's going to be mixed, readily formulated ones for a lot of this that are available in kind of your hardware stores or online as well, garden centers, things like that. Um, Basal bark is essentially kind of a similar concept of using uh, a slightly higher concentration of the active ingredient than the foliar application, because you're not spraying the leaves, you're spraying the bark of the tree in this case, or large shrub. It's good for smooth barked shrubs or trees, the diameter between maybe 2 or 6 inches. And you want to have like a band of a foot and a half, where you spray all the way around the tree trunk. And this is uh, great for leaf off season, so like fall, late fall that can work for it. So it gives you, again, just sort of depending on the timing of when uh, can get in there. That's something to consider. It's probably like, maybe, I don't know, maybe equally as labor intensive. I'm not really sure, depending on what you've got there as far as the different, or foliar as opposed to basal bark. But it is definitely, you got to like kind of hit each stem. So again, this is probably going to depend on what your target is. If it's a lot of younger Norway maple, for example, I could see this working pretty well. Um, or some other large, yeah, kind of large shrub, smooth bark shrubs that are mostly single stem. This could work well. Cut stem is one where we end up here at the park at Acadia implement quite often. Although it does take a while, it can be kind of slow. It's kind of a two-step process. Uh, the reasons we like it, so basically what we do is you come in and you've got large shrubs in particular, or trees, and you're cutting it down to the stump, kind of as low as you can go. And then you're also right then and there using your herbicide to treat just the stump itself, right on the living tissue around the stump, so that it can draw down into the root system, and prevent any sprouting. Again, what the reason why we kind of like to use this often, for especially these woody shrubs, is that you can kind of take away that biomass. We usually then just like either cut it up a little bit smaller and scatter it just right on site. Sometimes you pile it up, but you don't really want to make huge piles necessarily. And definitely don't pile in wetlands if you can. So it's kind of that thing, if you've got just the right amount. We kind of use it when we have quite a few of these around, but not too much, because if what helps for us is that if we can remove this above ground biomass a little bit, scatter it about, it gives us a little bit more access for a follow-up visit the next year at that site. And you end up often always getting stump sprouts anyway. And like I mentioned before, you could kind of take the approach of this cut stem approach, where you're like cutting one year, but then you're doing the herbicide the next year with a foliar. This is just, you're using a little bit of a higher concentration for this stem itself. And the other benefit to this is that it can be done uh, out of the growing season, or out of the leaf on season. So that's kind of nice. And then, along with just the cut stem or cut stump approach, you can have use different tools for applying the herbicide. You can use a paint stick or wand with a dabber, kind of, it dabs the herbicide right onto the stem, the cut stems. And this one is kind of nice because it's very directed to what you touch, right? And so as long as you're just touching the stems that you want to treat, then that's it. And then so your kind of your off target kill is quite low, and so that's great. Just being aware that sometimes these can be kind of messy, if it's kind of dripping out there and a little bit harder to clean. But these can be kind of a nice tool to use along with that cut stem approach. And then I just wanted to point out with vines in particular, probably for us in Maine, the main one is going to be Asiatic bittersweet. But it could, as we as we unfortunately see other vines coming in and invading the state, invasive vines. This may be something to to think about as well, where the larger vines in particular, we use a windowing approach where it's essentially just like a tree or the shrub cut stem application where you're cutting at the base and you're treating the herbicide at the base. But we also like to cut and you can kind of see here, cut the stem of a vine. This is a bittersweet vine, kind of up higher as well, so and down below at the ground. So you're creating this window. Here's the cut stems right here, for a couple of reasons. Really, a lot of it is just sort of uh, logistical in a way, to where it shows you what you've treated. So if you're coming into that same area again, you know that that's been a a treated vine. So that's very simple thing. The other thing is that it also, if you're removing for the seedlings that are coming up of bittersweet, they just kind of wrap up on anything. So it's just helping to reduce another point of contact for them to climb up, because they're really climbing up these trees and girdling them eventually, right, and helping to bring them down. Um, One thing that we don't usually like to do, especially if they're a larger vine, is to tear them out of the tree. Uh, and we do this just so that we don't injure the tree by breaking a branch or something like that. If it's a small enough of a vine and you can pull it out, that's great. So that doesn't, provide more weight for the tree itself and provide, um, a possibility for injury for the tree because of wind or something else. That is nice, but we usually kind of leave those in, and they do deteriorate on their own over time and eventually kind of fall off in pieces. Then we have the hack and frill or hack and squirt, frill and spray kind of technique, where it again is sort of this instituting an injury into the plant and a way, for you to use herbicide to get into the living part of the plants that can draw it down, and kill it systemically there. Uh, Typically, this would be used on hardwoods, trees that are too big for basal spray. So we're thinking, larger than 6-inch diameter. This can happen. Um, it is a targeted approach, right? So you practically have no off-target kill with this. This method can, um, it can be desirable also if you want to create wildlife habitat. So let's say you've got some Norway maple. I'll just use for example here, uh, and you've got some different sizes, but you want to leave kind of a large one for a snag. Dead snag for wildlife habitat. That's something that you could do with this, but you're also ensuring that the tree won't sprout new life from below, so that you're still actively managing it. And it can be done basically any time of year, except for avoiding sort of that early spring sap flow time when it's sending nutrients up into the tree. Really, you want it a time of year. So like late fall, for example, is a good time when things are getting more drawn down. Um, but in these images here, this is essentially kind of a hatchet, where it's got sort of a modified hatchet, where at the sharp end it's just sort of a smaller little bit, so you can get a nice little cut right into there and just go all the way around and essentially girdle the tree that way. And then right, another way to injure a plant and then use herbicide to kind of finish it off, stem injection, which can be done for small woodies, but the one that we like to kind of highlight, or that I see that is used oftentimes, is for knotweeds, or um, other soft tissue kind of hollow cane uh, plants. So this could be a giant hogweed could be an example too of one where you can use a tool like this stem injection systems tool. This is a United Kingdom company that sells this one in particular, um, that you can, it essentially marks and shoots in the herbicide right into this hollow cane when you kind of stab it with pierce it, with this little pointer there. And so that's a nice way to kind of be able to hit a lot of different things. This is very labor intensive, so um, it might be one where I wouldn't necessarily recommend it in every knotweed patch, uh, but in certain circumstances, I think it works pretty well. I did include this quote that was from the website, so take it as a you know advertisement. But the stem injection system says that it's very specific to target species. The treatment can be completed in all kind of conditions and near water when the with relevant applicator licenses. So something to consider if you kind of have checked off as not being an option for foliar application, for example, of the knotweed, and you're kind of like, okay, what other options should we be considering? This may be one of them.
Okay, thanks so much, Jesse, for this great presentation. So I'm going to pick up here on the topic of flame weeding with a propane torch. I'm going to say right off the top that I don't have personal experience with this method, and mostly I'm relying on an article that was published in the Smithsonian magazine in 2016 for the information here. So just to note, first of all, that obviously when you're throwing fire around, this has got some serious risk potential. So you need to pay careful attention to weather conditions and consult your local fire authorities before using this method. But as you can see in the photograph, this involves a propane tank and torch, and this has a backpack mount, but I've also seen them on like a pulley, like a wheeled dolly that you would carry behind you, to pull behind you, which obviously has limited off-trail capacity or usefulness. But what the review from 2016 found was that this would be most effective for herbaceous annuals and obviously less effective on perennial woody vegetation with deep roots, and that repeated applications were needed even for the herbaceous materials. So I would say that this is probably more of sort of an experimental method, and this would be something that if you were interested, if a landowner was interested in doing this. We might need to talk that through to sort of get a prescription that would be effective. So I think there would be some situations in which this would be appropriate, but we don't have a lot of experience with it, and it would probably not be something that would be realistic to prescribe for woody vegetation with deep roots. Furthermore, another approach to invasive plant control is biological control. And so most of the time when we hear the word biological control, we're thinking about classical biological control with insects. And this is an example of which is the purple loosestrife system, which I actually mentioned earlier this morning, where there were several different species of beetles in different sort of guilds that feed on different parts of the plants. Um, and this requires really careful research. So you have to go to the native range of the plant and you have to find insects or other organisms like a fungus or something like that that would target the plant specifically. The insect has to be reared and tested on similar species like congeners, plants in the same genus, because the USDA has very strict regulations regarding amount of damage that the insect or agent can do to native plants, or else it will not be accepted for biological control. Is a whole long research and permitting process that has to happen. And so it takes, decades in some cases for a biocontrol agent to go through that process. So we don't have a lot, which is why we don't have a lot of them. And for some plants, we have not been able to find insects that are specific enough and that are effective enough. So there's two sort of important characteristics. Is the agent specific enough? In other words, will it only eat the target and not go and start eating things we don't want it to eat? And then number two is it effective? In other words, can it really put the hurt on the target? And so in research right now are biocontrol insects for knotweeds, phragmites, swallowworts, as well as some other things. Water chestnut is an aquatic plant, so not super relevant for us. And, there are insect controls of insects. So hemlock woolly adelgid is an invasive insect, and there are some parasitic wasps which are being released for biocontrol of hemlock woolly adelgid. So that's kind of a little bit about biological control. Jesse, if you hit the next button, I think there's one more. Yeah. So the Cornell New York Invasive Species Research Institute, which is the link on the slide there that I just had for a second, is a great source of information about current research on biological controls that are relevant to our region. But going on to a different form of biological control, which would be animals, such as goats and sheep. My take-home message here is that the use of goats and sheep for invasive plant control needs careful planning and professional help. So it's not just like, oh, my neighbor has some goats and I'll just borrow them from a day. It's a very planned process. So goats only remove the above ground tissue. So, we're talking about just it's a sort of like cutting, only obviously there are some additional impacts from the hooves and feces. It's part of a long-term plan on a site. It's not a one-shot kind of deal. Goats and sheep, well, goats in particular, I know much less about sheep, but goats are fairly indiscriminate eaters. They mostly consume woody vegetation. So the photo on the lower part of the slide here is showing the goats with what I believe is Japanese stiltgrass. And I don't actually know that that would be really successful. So mostly goats are interested in woody vegetation. So that's something to be aware of. And depending on what kind of habitat it is, there can be issues with goat poop. So that's something else to keep in mind. So you really want to think about what plant species are present and what is the size of their seeds is another factor with goats. I did find a paper indicating that if the goats were chewing on plants that had seeds, seeds greater than 4 millimeters long were unlikely to be recovered from feces intact. In other words, the goat's digestive system, if the seed was greater than 4 millimeters, which is pretty small, less than half a centimeter, those seeds were effectively destroyed almost all the time. But smaller seeds, like stiltgrass, for example, posed a higher dispersal risk. So again, multiple things to think about here when thinking about potentially using goats or animals. The other thing I'll say is that, the goats have to be pretty hungry and they have to be penned. So that the idea is you designate a discrete area when you have the electric fencing, portable electric fencing, and they really target that area. And then you move them and they might target another area. So it's an interesting and certainly charismatic approach. I'm aware of some use in Maine. Again, as part of a bigger strategy, I think that can be useful as a one-off thing. It's not going to solve the problem in the long term, like with a patch of Japanese knotweed, for example. So just something to bear in mind. We have put together a little management library of resources for you all and listed them here with their links, with the exception of the first one, the field guide, which you have in your hands. So just a reminder that the Maine Invasive Plants Field Guide that we have mailed to all participants has a section on control, which goes over, control methods that are known to be effective for each species. We also recommend to you the Penn State Cooperative Extension Fact Sheet series, which was new last fall. They cover, I want to say, about 14 of the most common invasive plants that are found in forests. And they're very detailed fact sheets. And the Penn State folks have gone so far as to list specific herbicide products with, application rates that are within the range approved on the label. So that's great because, as government employees, we have to be very careful that we recommend things only as listed on a label. So that's terrific that is a resource that's available. I will say that, your plans don't have to get that specific. So most of the time it's down to the actual applicator who will be contracted to do the work to determine the final herbicide prescription. However, you very well might want to indicate, the type of application, whether that's foliar versus cut stem versus basal bark versus hack and squirt versus stem injection. And you could indicate the preferred active ingredient or type of product. So, we're going to have another herbicide boot camp where we'll go into, I think, a bit more detail, but here are some resources for that, as well as a document from the California Invasive Plant Council on best management practices for non-chemical weed control. Now, realizing that California has really different habitats than ours, there's still some references there that can be helpful regarding non-chemical weed control. You can also, of course, refer back to this presentation. Jesse has done a great job of bringing information together. And then for kind of a bigger picture take on invasive species control work, the Casco Bay Invasive Species Network created a little book called Winning the War on Weeds. And that's available online. And it does go through, again, some sort of a little bit of big picture stuff, but also some specific strategies. So those are some management resources for you. But to reiterate what's already been said, there's no silver bullets in this game. So you got to monitor and repeat treatments and use combinations of methods. It's really a long-term commitment, I would say, in many cases, depending on the site. Some sites are very lightly infested, and a 5-year plan will absolutely, eradicate stuff from the site. Other sites are not going to be that way, and even a 5-year plan is probably not the full management planning timeline that really will be needed to achieve complete containment or really effective suppression or control of outliers plus containment and suppression of mother load. So no silver bullets in this business. So moving on to the section of the presentation where we're going to talk about sort of some factors to consider when recommending different treatment methods. And the first one is really about the landowner. So the landowner preferences are the number one thing that you need to think about before you start recommending treatment methods. You got to talk to the landowner. And so the questionnaire that Joe Dembeck put together for the pre-site survey has a question about, when you're talking to the landowner, what kinds of control methods are you interested in using, and what is your capacity to do control on the site? What tools are at your disposal? How well do you know your property? How much are you out and about on the property? All those things could influence what recommendations you make. So that's the number one. And we strongly encourage you to have a nice, full conversation with the landowner about their preferences for management.
Thanks, Nancy. And maybe we should put in a plug if anybody can get a photograph of folks talking to landowners so that we can include any further presentations. That'd be great. I know it's something that, as manager of public space, we talk with our neighbors and other landowners a lot. But it's good to kind of document that process so that we can share that and share kind of what works and what doesn't work too with that kind of back and forth that communication with the landowners on the property that they're managing, but also neighbors too. So integrated pest management it may be a term, or it's certainly an approach that many folks have heard of. It's often described in kind of an 11-step process, but with help from Nancy, we're kind of boiling this down to about 6-ish or so kind of main factors to consider with what an IPM approach actually is. So I think of this as a bit of a holistic approach kind of thing. It's a risk reduction, a strategy for pests that are science-based and site-specific. And so when you think about, okay, what does this mean? So essentially, if you start with what is the pest, so in this case, what's your invasive plant, and understanding its biology and understanding kind of the way it works throughout the year. So you can think about kind of the most ideal ways and efficient ways to manage it, and researching those best control tactics. So what kind of things are going to be efficient, realistic, timely, those kind of questions. Choosing your least aggressive method as possible, so that you can get the job done, but have the lowest risk and be most effective. And often those least aggressive, that may be, you know, in terms of what kinds of machinery you might be using, but certainly also think of it aggressive in kind of like, kind of high test herbicide too, right? And kind of keeping that down just to the levels that are going to be required to do the job, but not much beyond that. Emphasizing prevention really is key with a lot of this. I'm sure Nancy and others have mentioned this over and over, and avoiding the spread, and then monitoring over time so you can see that your suppression efforts are working. You can make modifications. Have that adaptive management approach as you move into different phases of management. Eradication is fantastic. It's not often the only good goal that you can have. Honestly, it's not really a word that I use very much anymore. Full suppression, things like that, managed is great. So that kind of, can be a good enough a goal too, especially if the objectives you have for that site, for that land, right? Whether it's for production of certain timber or whatever, right? And wildlife habitat and you name it, you're trying to at least tamp down the invasives to the point to where the ecosystem can function and you can have these other ecosystem services going, and you can have the rest of the objectives for that land follow through. And use pesticides when necessary, because sometimes they're absolutely necessary to having a realistic approach, but it's try not to have them usually be your first and choice, because it's the easiest kind of thing. And this is also, I think, boiling it then further down to kind of that adaptive management approach. I would say, think of this also as, in terms of like how the site is going to change over time and decades, and with climate and all these other environmental changes, how this kind of approach helps, so you don't have a plan that's just one thing forever.
Yeah, so another factor as you consider what type of control to propose is the timeline available to you and the resources available. So, for example, if a harvest is planned for next year, then you may need to think about a more aggressive method of dealing with the plants that are present in that harvest area, if possible before the harvest or soon after the harvest. So factors such as what the landowner has planned, which can change based on markets for the products are outside of our control sometimes, but we just need to work our treatments around that in the best way possible. So the timeline on the property can strongly influence what you choose to do. And then the next bullet here is about, what equipment the landowners have and are they willing and able to work on the property themselves? And that's especially important for follow-up monitoring and follow-up treatments. So it may be that the landowner can receive funding through this program for one or maybe two bouts of treatment. We do hope to get more funding and continue to offer the program. But in the long term, there's going to be some level of control that probably the landowner would have to do themselves to maintain a long-term plan on the property. After all, it's their property. So, thinking about what resources are available to the landowner and their own ability to do the work could influence the kinds of treatments that you prescribe. So for example, if you're working with a landowner who says straight up to you, I have no funding available to implement anything. So that might, seriously impact what you would be recommending for that landowner. In terms of herbicide-specific considerations, the first one to think about is the pesticide notification registry. So this is a registry which is maintained sort of at a town level. It's maintained by the Bureau of Pesticide Control, and it's basically an opt-in list where people can say, I want to be notified if my neighbors are using pesticides. And so the list is arranged by town so that so that you can look and see whether anyone next door to your client's property is on the registry. And it might just be beneficial. It's not that you can't use a herbicide or a pesticide, but it might be beneficial to have a conversation proactively between the landowner and their neighbor, just to make sure that there's no surprises and that everybody understands what's going on. So that's one thing that you could, or the landowner and you could check. The next thing is whether there are any town pesticide ordinances in effect. So you may have heard that several of the larger cities in Maine, Portland and South Portland, have passed some pretty strict pesticide ordinances. And so that can limit your choice of tools. The list of town pesticide ordinances is maintained by the Maine Board of Pesticide Control, and we provided a link to that. There are other towns throughout the state that have various ordinances, so that's something that you will want to check. The next bullet there talks about whether there is any organic certified farm area either on the property, on the property. So if the property that your client has, if part of it is certified as part of an organic production area, then the landowner and the plan preparer, probably the landowner at least, needs to consult with the certifier to determine acceptable potential use of herbicide in the non-farm areas. And just to note that, maple sugaring can be certified organic too. So just because there's not like a traditional sort of vegetable farm, don't assume that there's not a certification. So again, when you have your initial conversation with the landowner, I just want to make sure that you ask, are you organic certified on any part of your ownership?
Another thing to consider is if the property is open to the public or recreational uses. I mean, even if it's just kind of having members of the community being able to walk a trail that's on this private property. Um, you want to have along with having commercial applicator licensed applicator, you want to think about posting that those areas where people are along trails is kind of the common thing. I mean, you think of this with lawns everywhere, right? They get the little sign. So just thinking about that, it's got to be up there for 48 hours, and you have to have kind of the caution words and some information there is required. Just a little bit of a additive that we like to do in the public lands that I work on is to also provide a little bit of information about uh, the work and what you're doing and sort of the messaging of the point and what we're doing. And so I like to also be specific about there being invasive plant management and what products we're using is kind of helpful.
And just to note here, just on this topic, this is not something that you have to put in your plan. It's just something that you need to think about. So as you're preparing your plan and choosing methods, it's just another factor to consider. So.
Yeah, thanks. And then, so then we have sensitive areas, like shoreland zoning and wetlands, for example. Um, the, there are extra additional rules and precautions to take when here, both if you're using herbicides, but then also if you're removing vegetation at all. And so we're just kind of, this is again a very broad overview of sort of what the state shoreline zoning kind of parameters are. So this is like what we're talking about: 250 feet from the upland edge of oceans, coastal and freshwater wetlands, and great ponds. So those are usually ponds greater than 10 acres, I believe, and 75 feet of streams. You got resource protection zones that may be more restrictive. And so kind of what we're wanting to highlight here is that if you're working in an area that's next to these sensitive areas, is to start engaging with your community code enforcement officer, town or city code enforcement, or town office for permits and other information that they have. Also, the Maine DEP shoreline zoning by town. There's a link that we'll have provided here. Uh, which does have some information by town what's going on, because each town kind of then again has the state level regs, but then can adopt some further restrictions and in more detail about what they allow in those areas. And so something again, just basically like making sure to check in with about to get some more specific information there. And so this, I just kind of highlighted one example from the town of Bucksport's supplemental shoreline vegetation standards. They do have in there an exemption number 6 where you can remove non-native invasive vegetation species provided that it meets certain minimum qualifications. So it's with removal within 25 feet of shoreline. It's just hand tools, so you're not bringing equipment for erosion and kind of water quality issues, right? And if clearing the vegetation, remove if it exceeds it, then uh, you have this sort of compliance thing you have to think about. And then also just it can happen to you, probably won't, hopefully, but it has happened to some towns. For example, in 2016 in Kennebunkport, they were kind of dinged with a penalty on a land trust that was cutting invasive shrubs in a shoreland zone. And unfortunately, there were a lot of legal fees associated with that as well. So again, probably just kind of the point we're making here, we're not going to give you like sort of the full list of what you need to consider, but just thinking about these areas you're working in, or you're going to be writing up the plans for and making recommendations for. Also, maybe getting in the contact of who that code enforcement officer or whoever that point of contact is for the town to get more specificity about what might be required for permits.
Okay, and so that's sort of the conclusion of the main part of our presentation this morning about an overview of various control methods. And what we'd like to do next is talk a little bit about some conundrum situations. And I'm just looking, so I'm checking the time here. So it's 11:42. We have until noon. So yeah, I think what we'll do maybe is talk about some conundrum situations for about 8 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes left for Q&A. So one of the potential conundrums is a reliable labor source for non-herbicide work, mechanical and manual work. And so I just want to make sure everyone is aware that the Maine Natural Areas Program does maintain a list of non-herbicide or herbicide plus invasive plant control providers. And so, this includes some local landscaping companies as well as some other kinds of companies and individuals who do this sort of work. And so I would really love it if anyone on the call and the training does, provides non-herbicide services and would be willing to be listed. We'd love to list you on the list. So there are providers who are willing to do that work. I think that it's not always people who are already in, for example, landscaping business, they might be very open to doing that work. It might just not be something that they advertise or have thought about advertising as a specific service before. So we just need to cultivate awareness of what the services are and that there is a market for these services. And so one of the ways that we're trying to do that is getting folks listed on a list like this so that when people call us or when people want to know who can help them in a non-herbicide way, that information is available. So I will just say, obviously, there are potentially clients who might struggle to find someone talking about, kind of outside of this program that, just like people struggle to find good service providers for a variety of things. So you can't always find like the perfect provider. However, we'd like to work on increasing awareness of this as a business service that businesses can offer, and we'd like to certainly keep adding to our list of potential providers. Jesse, anything else that you wanted to say about this?
Not really. I think that's great. I think that's something I'm seeing in my neck of the woods crop up a little bit more is sort of these more traditional landscape companies, at least off, maybe they're not advertising outright, but offering a little bit more knowledgeable control of invasives. So that's good, kind of starting there. It doesn't hurt if you don't have a lot of landscaping companies around available, if your community has conservation commissions or thinking about sort of that quasi volunteer yet municipal group that might have interest in helping out some way. I don't know if that really would apply to many of these plans, but Yeah, I think that covers it, Nancy.
The other thing I just, Jesse, I have the benefit of being able to see the chat since I'm not sharing my screen. So something came up about AmeriCorps.
Ah,
Yeah, so the Maine Conservation Corps is providing some mechanical control services on their field team crews, and I know of several different towns or maybe even organizations that have utilized Maine Conservation Corps crews to do trail building plus some invasive plant mechanical removal. So that's another potential source, that yeah, it could be within or without of this program, but that's another factor to consider is AmeriCorps. And then I just wanted to also say, for the folks who are working with municipal clients or, land trust clients, don't underestimate the power of committed groups of volunteers. So, if you've got a nice hardy group of volunteers, a dozen people who are willing to come and work on a property twice a year, for half a day at a time, boy, you can make progress. So that's a great thing to provide invasive plant service days with a structured, defined area, a specific goal that makes people feel like they've really accomplished something and they're not just pushing against the tide because you just turn them loose on this huge property. It's that you've got a defined area. You've carefully selected so that they feel like they really made a difference and accomplished a goal and hopefully can see progress over time if they return to the site to do a follow-up round.
mhm.
Great.
So, yeah, I guess we could go over some issues that I tackle with it all the time and we've kind of mentioned this in a couple different slides already. So, for example, might be Japanese knotweed, which is such a tenacious plant. It's one of the most difficult things uh, to control anyway. And then you have it loves riparian areas and right, wet soils and along riverbanks and things like that. And so you're trying to balance this potentially aggressive approach if you can to actually have hope, but yet you want to restrain what methods you might use because you're in these sensitive habitats. And so this is something where it's probably going to have to be a case by case thing. I mean, Nancy mentioned the example of Duck Trap River, and we've seen other areas where you can do, coverings might be the thing that you're going to do over a period of time, and that very well may work, especially if it's a lot of knotweed. Maybe you only have like a few stems that are beginning and they're mixed in with a lot of other native vegetation. You're right on that shoreline. Maybe you could take a different approach, but you don't want to do a lot of foliar spray because of where you are. Maybe it's got a lot of other like good wildflowers around too. So, again, we're not necessarily providing like the straight answer here, but there are these situations that are a little bit difficult and require a little nuance and kind of uh, things that are kind of outside of the box thinking, perhaps a little bit for where these sites are. And so we just this is one example, one find that is pretty difficult.
Yeah,
Anything to add, Nancy, on this one
I'll just echo
specifically?
what you said, Jesse, that it's really a site by site kind of approach. And you know, there are definitely permit and rule issues when working in wetlands. And so you got to plan ahead, you got to talk to all the right people. And even then, it can be challenging. So prevention, nip it in the bud and tell the landowner, to keep a hawk sharp eye out for any new stands because new stands, we can act on much more easily. Once it gets as bad as what Jesse's showing in this picture, boy, that's a real challenge. So
Yeah.
prevention, prevention, prevention.
Yep. I don't. We got about a minute left, Nancy. I don't know if you want. We could mention this possibility of,
Yeah, go for it.
then you think of like wildlife habitat, and that we have, we have rare, endangered, threatened wildlife and some of populations that really love early successional habitat. So one example might be New England cottontail habitat in southern Maine specifically, but loving these shrublands essentially. And as we all know, many of these shrublands, whether it's like an old field that is starting to succeed and kind of let go, or if it's managed specifically for that shrubland habitat via removal of plants every so often or fire or something, they tend to be infested with invasives. So there's that balance, right, of what we're trying to do. And so while a lot of these areas that New England cottontail also have a lot of invasives in it, and you want to kind of keep that structure, maybe there's a way over time, and you can kind of keep just the right amount of habitat for them, what's needed. So, and in many of these, I mean, if that's an RT species, you're kind of working with Fish and Wildlife and other agencies to kind of figure out the right plan for that area. But just something to kind of keep in mind. What else do you have? What other living things and critters and other kinds of stuff on the landscape?
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much, Jesse. This was terrific. And I think what I'd like to do now is ask Jan, if you had earmarked any particular questions that Jesse and I should address regarding control methods.
Yeah, I'll try to go back through. Before I do that, though, I'm just going to add a specific site, which I didn't hear you mention in this last conundrum with New England Cottontail, the Fort Williams Park in South Portland or Cape Elizabeth is a great example of where they struggled for many years to address the invasive plant problem at the park and finally got the approvals to go forward with management or removal and transitioning the site to native plants, and it's turned out to be just a beautiful example
Oh, good.
of what can be done. So if that's an issue that you're looking at, I highly recommend making a visit. So some of these may have been addressed, and we can pass over them quickly. Sherry Bernal asks, she's heard it's best to leave vines, shrubs, knotweed intact until herbicide treatment for best effect of a chemical approach. Is this correct, and does it vary by species? I think you guys addressed certainly the last part of it, but are there specific species that you recommend leaving intact?
Jesse, do you want to jump in there?
Let me make sure I understand. So leaving vines or shrubs intact until when?
For herbicide treatment, as opposed to, early in your presentation when you were talking about brush hogging and then treating.
Gotcha. Right. Yes. Right. Um, yes. So certainly right. So there's sort of if you're going to be doing removal, then you're no longer going to be able to do the foliar treatments, for example. And for the cut stem application, depending on the product you're using, especially if it's a water based, you really need to do that treatment right away, like within half an hour. If it's an oil based, you might have longer time than that. Um, and so yeah, you do kind of need to make sure that whatever herbicide kind of strategy you're using, it's gonna kind of work out, if that's the way I'm understanding it, the question.
I'd also like to, it looks like Ron Lemin has his hand raised. Ron, if you wanted to comment on that particular question, you can unmute yourself.
Um, I think it all depends on the density, and I mean, it's not a black and white answer. So if you've got vegetation that's so tall, you're not going to do a foliar treatment. You're going to go in and mow it down and then come back and do a foliar treatment when the vegetation's at a lower level where you're going to use less herbicide. And that's the whole idea of IPM, is combining strategies to use less herbicide if you're going to use herbicide. And so you may have to mow or cut. If it's too tall, then you're going to want to do the basal or cut stem. You're not going to want to try and spray it at the top of the plant. So if you've got a crew going through with a brush saw, you're going to be cutting them and treating them stumps. If you don't have a brush saw, you can do the basal stem instead, where you only touch each plant once instead of having to go back and look at each plant twice. So from a labor standpoint, it depends on what labor you have too. So it's not always an easy question. And I mean, and Jesse talked about cutting bittersweet vines, and I've cut bittersweet vines, not me, but a landowner, and laid them on the ground. And those bittersweet vines grew roots and sprouts off of the pieces of wood that we cut off. And I mean, that's just an aggressive plant. I've never seen any other hardwood plant we have in Maine or this area do that. But you have to be careful about stuff like that. Just letting them lay in the crown's the best thing to do. So.
Thanks, Ron.
I don't know. I can go on for hours and
Yeah,
hours.
I'm going to cut you off because you sort of segued into another question that I saw in the chat. So someone asked about which species should we not leave the biomass lying around. So let's address that now. I would say that for most of our woody shrubs and trees, most of the time, if you've just got cut biomass, most of the time, if you can get that, up off the ground, so that it's not in direct contact with the soil, you can feel pretty good about leaving that in the woods. I sometimes pile a few sticks and then put my biomass on top. But there are some species, like Ron noted, where there's enough energy stored in that above ground part that it could put down a little rootlet. Knotweed is a notorious example of a plant that can sprout from the nodes. So you got to be real careful with knotweed material, that it's not in contact with the soil and it's not left in a place where it could wash into a river or stream and be carried downstream where it could then come in contact with soil. But when you're pulling small plants, I also encourage you, if you're going to leave the pulled plants in the forest, then leave the roots up, hang them in the crotch of a shrub or something like that, so that the roots are not in contact with the ground. But in general, I leave a lot of material in the woods, so I do think that that's appropriate. You just have to use caution.
Yep, and I'll add to that, Nancy. I have seen glossy buckthorn reroot, especially if it's left where there's water, so if it's wet ground. And then the other thing, another reason not to drag your stuff all over between there and back is if you happen to be removing it when it's got mature seed, we just don't want to spread that all over the forest. So that's another reason we tend to try to keep things pretty localized. And thanks, Ron. That was great. Yeah, addition.
In regards to knotweed, are root barriers successful in either containing small knotweed infestations or preventing movement of larger infestation while non-chemical eradication is employed?
I have no experience with that. Jesse, do you have any experience with that?
So root barriers, kind of in the soil, whether it's kind of like edging material.
That's my understanding. I've got a project myself that they're employing that. I'm curious.
I don't know, unless you can drive it down 15, 20 feet. I don't think so. I mean, it literally, you can go on Google and see it coming through pavement and through people's foundations, crap. It's a good, I think it wouldn't hurt if somebody is, but it may not help very much is my initial thought, because of how well they can do going under and out 30 feet under, plastic and then popping up again, kind of thing. It's a challenge.
Okay. Let's see here. I think did others have their hands up?
I don't think we had anybody else with their hands up. I think that was Ron still with his hand up. So I think we got that.
I tried to put Ron's hand down and I wasn't able to do so. I had been doing that previously. And then I want to say, yeah, I don't see anybody else's hands up besides Ron's. Okay.
Great. So thanks so much again, Jesse, for sharing your wisdom and experience with us about selecting control methods. This was sort of part one of our control introductions. We're going to have a more deeper dive into herbicides, so we'll have a chance to ask some additional practitioners, very experienced practitioners, some questions on day 3. There was a unrelated question in the chat regarding IMAP, so I'm going to kind of go back to IMAP now. There was a question about, what happens if someone maps some records onto private land without landowner permission. So I just want to first say that the onus is on IMAP users when they agree to the IMAP user agreement. They are agreeing to only map with the permission of the landowner, and so that is something that users agree to. And when we look at records in IMAP, we have to, at some level, take users' word that they have followed the user agreement. At the Maine Natural Areas Program, when we are reviewing observations, if there are a whole bunch of observations by someone we don't know that look like they might be on private property, again, it's hard to tell sometimes. We don't have a super, 110% complete conservation lands layer. So sometimes there are lands that are public that we don't know about, municipal lands in particular, we don't have a complete layer. We might reach out to that person before confirming their records to say, hey, you know, we noted some records and just wanting to make sure that if those are on private land, it's your land or you have permission. To be honest, you know, we don't have a whole lot of people from, you know, sort of community scientists out mapping a lot of observations. A lot of the people who are mapping things in IMAP, we know who they are because they're our partners or they're land trust stewards or they are community scientists who are known to us. So it's not common, I guess I would say, that we have, you know, sort of suspicions about that. There could be, you know, records in IMAP that, you know, remain unconfirmed because of that. There could also be times when it's one record and it might get confirmed anyway. So that's my response to that question. Kyle just points out that, you know, one of the field sites that some of you went to is not in the conserved land layer. That's and so, you know, the conserved lands are getting conserved actively, you know, as we go forward in time, and that layer has to get updated, and so there can be a delay. So that's just good to note. Kim, I see that you have your hand up. Do you have a question? Are you returning to your question from iMapInvasives before?
I am, if that's okay, since we
Yes,
kind
go
of
ahead.
swing back that way. So yesterday when we were walking around, you had mentioned, especially in Pondicherry Park, where we had a lot of the invasives in one area, and you said that we would need to put separate overlapping polygons. But today, and I'm sure it you know, it may have been just for demonstration point, when you mapped that area, you put 3 different species in that one polygon. So is it okay to do that in IMAP, but we need to show the maps as separate polygons? Or I guess maybe describe that a little bit more if you would.
Of course, yeah, thanks, Kim. So in IMAP, what the workflow that I showed you allows you to draw one shape and indicate that there are multiple species in there. And then when you click save, when you actually click and it creates all these records, it creates 3 polygons. So in fact, there are now, it only looks like there's one on the map because it's the exact same polygon. But they are separate overlapping polygons by species. So I apologize that that wasn't clear, but you know, the polygons can be sitting right on top of each other. They can be identical in terms of their footprint, but they are separate for the different species. So you may remember that I put in different percent cover classes for the several species that I chose there. So they are separate polygons, in fact. Kim, does
Excellent.
that? Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. It probably was clear to everybody else but me. So thank you.
No, thank you for asking, Kim. I think typically if one person is confused, many people are confused. So thank you for that great point of clarification. Ron, go ahead with your previous question that you had.
My question was exactly the same. So when you find 5 invasives, you just take one GPS point, but you just take on your data sheet, you put 5 different species, and then when you go in, you enter it and make a polygon out of it. That was my question. If you wanted us to enter 5 different points in the field, or just collect 1 point and then later make it 5, make it a polygon.
Yeah, so just to be clear,
that you
Ron,
answered my question.
okay, so thank you. Just to be clear, you can actually do the same thing for points. So I was a little confused there. You were talking about a point and then making a polygon. So it's possible to have, you know, 3 invasive plants, small, right in one place. And in that situation, you could have a point with 3 plants, and there would, you know, when you click save, it would actually make 3 points. You could also have a big patch with 3 species, and you could stand in the middle of it and take a point and indicate, you know, the patch is 30 meters in diameter and your notes with the species, and then you would later make a polygon based on a buffer of the centroid. So several different potential situations. Does that make sense, Ron?
It does. I mean, just minimizing the number of points you have to take. It's just the notes you take with a specific point. So.
Absolutely. Okay, and so go ahead, Jan.
I was just going to say there was a question we missed way back. Jessica asks if we are able to recommend any weed wrench brands.
Yeah, so as Maddie noted a minute ago, we're not allowed to recommend specific brands as state employees, but I can tell you that there aren't that many out there. And I think that the brand that I bought most recently might have been called Puller Bear, bear like rawr bear, Puller Bear, Puller, Puller Bear, I think.
That's the one
so
we
that,
have too, Nancy.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jesse. So I know that that one, at least a few years ago, was available. I don't know if anyone else on the call can chime in.
Well, I was just going to say you can get different sizes too. So whether I don't necessarily have a preference at all on the make or model, but some of them have different sizes depending on what you're looking for. And they can be heavy. So keep that in mind.
Definitely. I see a new question from Jake about mapping again. So if I can't get to the middle of the patch, is there an option to indicate I'm on the edge? So yeah, so you can also draw a polygon by taking, sort of a series of coordinates around the edge, or even, mapping a series of points with your iMap app around the edge, and just putting in the notes, I'm at the southeast edge, and then you walk a little further around the edge of the patch and you say, now I'm at the northeast edge or whatever. That's perfectly acceptable, and you could use either notes or points from the app to later draw the polygon on the screen based on based on a series of coordinates or based on points from the app that you had previously uploaded. So some way you do have to kind of pin down the edges of whatever it is you're trying to map, but you could do that by a couple of different ways. You wouldn't necessarily have to go to the middle and estimate the radius. There are other ways you could do that. So it's 12:06. I know that some people have a distance to travel to get to their field sites. I want to see if there are, we might have time for one more burning question if anyone has a burning question. And then I have just one housekeeping item that I want to mention before we break for our day 2 field sites. So why don't I cover my housekeeping question or housekeeping point, and if any question is burning, it'll come up. So you may notice that in addition to doing your site data entry and making maps and writing the summary paragraphs for the mini plan, there is in the homework between day 2 and day 3, there is an open book online ID quiz. And I just wanted to let you know that that's in progress, and we're not quite ready to share it with you yet, but we will be tomorrow. So look for that tomorrow, and that hopefully should take about half an hour. So that's my one housekeeping note. Again, the purpose of our field site today is to survey the site. So you'll meet your host, and there may be some overview, but then you're going to be working maybe on your own or maybe maybe with a buddy to collect data, take data using your whatever tools you prefer. And get all the information that you need in order to write the mini plan, which consists again of the summary paragraphs about the invasive plants on the site, the maps excluding the property boundary, and the prioritized management recommendations. So take notes for yourself today at your field site so that you can have enough information that when you sit down to enter data, you have enough. And when you sit down on day 3 to start writing your prioritized recommendations, you feel like you're ready to go. I sometimes just make, a list, a very basic list, like number 1, number 2, number 3, just my top, sort of right as I get home from the site so that it's fresh in my mind. What are my top things that I think are going to be my recommendations? And then after I've kind of entered data and made maps, I go back and I say, okay, does this still make sense now that I can kind of see this all laid out in front of me? Does that still make sense? Or, oh, gee, yeah, it looks like there's really a lot more glossy buckthorn than I thought. Maybe I need to adjust where that's prioritized. So that's kind of the goal for today. And if there are no additional burning questions or housekeeping questions, we can sign off. I don't see any hands or new chat. So I want to say thank you so much to Joe Dembeck and Maddie Eberly and Jesse Wheeler for all your help this morning. And thank you again to the field site hosts. And we will see you back on this Teams or on the separate Teams meeting next Tuesday.